a little bit of work to do today. Actually, not work. We have it's informational brief from a couple companies that manufacture aircraft detection lighting systems for wind turbines. And since we have a bill we're going to hear beginning on Wednesday, Senate Bill 478, which deals with the aviation lighting, I thought it would be interesting to listen, have some information from two of these companies so we can see what the state of the technology is, maybe have an opportunity to ask them some questions and get a pretty good sense of what these things can and can't do. And that way we'll be ready to talk about that bill coming up on Wednesday and Thursday. So to get started, we've got a first presentation is a technical overview of the aviation lighting system from Jeff Schleicher, who's the Senior Manager of Wind Energy Services for Terma. And Jeff, are you online with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We sure can. Go ahead and we'll look at your presentation. And I think what we'll do is have you do a presentation, give you about 15 minutes or so maximum. And then we'll have the second presentation, then we'll try to open it up for questions from the committee. So we'll turn the floor over to you, Jeff.
Okay, first of all, thank you, committee, for inviting us to have this presentation. I can't see the slides, so let's see. That's just me. Do we have the slides up?
Let me check with our IT person here. Jay, do you want to go ahead and put the slides up for Jeff? Jeff, do you want our IT person to advance the slides for you, or are you going to advance them yourself?
That seems technical. I don't know if I can do that, but I'll tell you what. I'll just I'll let you guys do that. I'll just tell you when to switch over.
Okay, that sound good, Jay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll go that route. All righty, all square. Here we go, Jeff.
Okay, next slide, please. So my name is Jeff Schleicher. I'm the Senior Manager of Wind Energy Services for Terma. I'm going to give you a little introduction on Terma, very brief, and then we'll talk about the history of ADLS, a little bit look into the technology. We'll talk about the vendors. Hi, Gary, I see you out there. And then why would you go with ADLS in the first place, and some final thoughts. Next slide, please. So Terma is a global company, next slide, with Danish roots. So what I mean by that is we are a wholly owned subsidiary of the Danish manufacturer of many radars, next slide, and other products across naval systems in the air and space. We do the leading edge skins for the F-35 aircraft and other mission and communication pods for other aircraft. We also do things in space, communication and timing type activities. Next slide. And then we have our surveillance and mission systems. This is who I work for. We've got 3,000 radars deployed worldwide for a number of mission areas: coastal surveillance, border security. You can see all the different mission areas. And we didn't create a new radar for the wind energy industry. We simply applied the same radar with a little bit of extra processing around it for the wind farm solutions. And although we're here today to talk about ADLS, it's really about obstruction lighting control. There's various technologies that have been looked into that, and I'll talk about that. But there's also other applications for radar in the wind energy industry if you're ever interested. Next slide. So this all started in December of 2015 when the FAA for the first time allowed the aviation obstruction lights to be disabled, assuming there was enough sensors in the area to enable the lights when a target came into the wind farm zone. And I say enough sensors. Back in the day, it used to be the wording in the AC-70 was that radar activated lighting system, and that's been changed. So there's a horizontal coverage, meaning if a plane comes within 3 nautical miles of the nearest wind turbine, or if the plane is at 200 feet above the ground, up to 1,000 feet above the highest man-made point in the wind farm, including the tip heights, that defines a volume of airspace in which the lights should be controlled, in this case by the radar. Next slide. So there was various technologies considered. You know, like I said, the FAA has termed it sensor-based systems. So the first kind of technology that was looked at was shielding. That wasn't successful or approved. That was just merely if you will, a bowl underneath a light to keep the light from shining down, and it really didn't do anything to help the dark skies or keep the skies unlit for the community. There's also a lighting manufacturer out there that is looking at a dimming solution. That has been tested, as far as I know, for quite a while now. It still hasn't passed full approval by the FAA. One of the issues I've heard with it is that, you know, there's some technology things, but also it doesn't create dark skies for the community. It just creates less lit skies for the community. And so that leaves radar. It's really the only effective sensor right now that is being used for aircraft detection lighting systems. And there are various vendors that are selling that here and across the pond in Europe. And then I left a big question mark there because we don't really know what the next sensor or technology is that may be applied to this, this problem as a solution. Next slide. So there's the volume of airspace I was talking about. In the yellow, basically that's the FAA's defined warning zone. So if a plane touches that yellow zone, the lights should be enabled, and when the plane or planes exit the zone, the lights should be disabled. As you see there, there's also a kind of a purplish detection zone. That's what at least Terma uses as a bit of a larger barrier in order to make sure we have a solid track on the plane, make sure that the timing is right so that when the plane does touch the yellow zone that the lights will come on. That takes into account any latency issues in the fiber network or any other slowdowns. And the default here is that, you know, we don't turn the lights off. Basically, we suppress keeping the lights on. So in other words, if a glitch occurs in the system, that barrier goes away and the lights come on automatically. That's a safety feature or safety requirement that the FAA has. If there's any problem with communications or anything related to the radar or the comms between the radar and the lights, those lights all come on for safety reasons. And we have to figure out what happened and try to turn them back off again for the community. Next slide. So it's really a simple system architecture. I'm sure everybody kind of does something similar. My view here is from the Terma side, and that is we have a radar sensor that spins X-band 360-degree radar. It just keeps turning, looking in all directions. We have a 16-mile range, which gives us a 32-mile diameter circle of coverage. So that's a pretty big area. As long as you can fit the wind farm or wind farms within that area, we will be able to control the wind farm with that single radar. In some cases, we need to move to a second radar. But that radar is putting out hundreds and hundreds of messages to what we like to call the light control server. This is nothing more than a souped-up Dell laptop that listens to those messages, and when it hears something important, like, oh, there's a plane coming into the area, we then send a signal down to the LCMs in the nacelles, and we turn the lights off. So that LCM keeps all the lights in a hot standby mode, so when it's tickled, it either turns all the lights on in sync and at once, or it turns them off. And it resides on the wind farm network itself, so we work, that's okay, you can go ahead. We work well ahead of time with the customer to ensure that the fiber network of the wind farm is designed to accommodate the ADLS system. Now, here's a look at some simple deployments. On the left, you have about a 10-meter mast there. That is a simple tower with a platform that has the radar on top of it, as well as the equipment cabinet. The equipment cabinet contains things like radar equipment, plus the LCS that I was talking about, uninterruptible power supply, and other things. Those cables run into the ground, into a box at the bottom where all the comms and the electricity is supplied. And on the right there, well, that's my favorite ADLS picture. That is a 100-meter tower in the background in really snotty weather with the turbine in front. And you can see the radar tower is actually taller than the turbine. There's two radars there, one on a 30-meter tower. This is on a very thin ridge up in New Hampshire. So we kind of came into that project with the two locations already assigned to us, and we managed to pull that off. And there on the left, you'll see a close-up view of what the top of that ADLS deployment looks like. Next slide. So the radar system, at least ours that I know of, I don't know about everybody else's, but we have a highly configurable ADLS system from a single radar system where the entire wind farm is either controlled, enabled, or disabled at once. Or you can define autonomous zones. So in other words, if you had a large 10-mile by 10-mile wind farm, you wouldn't want to turn on all the lights in the wind farm that are very far away from where the plane is. So you can divvy that wind farm up in any way you want. And that's really a matter of discussing with the stakeholders, the developer, and finding out, how efficient they want to be with turning the lights on or off in terms of satisfying the community. We can also have multiple sensors that are also laid out with asymmetric zones and fused data presentation. Next slide. So here's a quick look at the kind of the history of the vendors. Laufer Wind, Eric Laufer, who I always call the father of ADLS, was the first to market. It was kind of a race between him and Terma. They got to the market first. He created a radar from scratch, which was a very expensive effort. It was a perimeter-only solution where you had to have 2 or more radars covering the wind farm. And he sold 2 systems and then promptly went out of business. We were right behind him in 2016. The difference between Terma and any of the other providers is that we are the manufacturer of the radar. The others are system integrators using a different radar. There's no reason why they couldn't use a Terma radar. But we manufacture the radar, and then we develop the systems around that. And as I said, we've been doing this a long time. We have a lot of systems out there worldwide. These are the same systems that are used for ADLS. We just simply use a different antenna for the various applications. And we have dozens of systems right now installed across Europe, North America, and in Canada. Right behind us, in fact, was Detect. And they, as I said, are a system integrator. They take a number of different sensors and they fuse that data into their own command and control system, if you will. They use a Kelvin Hughes radar, as does an up-and-coming radar company down at the bottom called C-Speed. They're going to use a Kelvin Hughes radar as well. They're not yet approved, although I hear they're testing. And then interestingly enough, Vestas, the large turbine manufacturer, attempted to create their own ADLS at one time. They bought out a system, a Norwegian passive radar called OCAS, found out it didn't scale very well, and then they went to a Japanese-based radar, which was very similar to the Kelvin Hughes radar that Detect and C-Speed uses and the one that we use. And they have not yet got that ready for prime time. So I don't know if they're coming back onto the market or not, but there are some options there for customers. Next slide. And then my last slide here, as you can see, a little self-promotion on the right there, my second favorite ADLS picture. The reason that's interesting is because that was at the Talbot Wind Farm up just southwest of Toronto. We had to drive miles down a dirt road through empty fields to look at the radar, the potential radar location, and randomly in the middle of nowhere was to stop the wind turbines. I mean, this is how passionate anti-wind folks are. And in order to put an ADLS in, or why would you put an ADLS in? Because you want to be a good partner. You want to try to eliminate one of the objections, at least, to wind farm development if you can, and ADLS is the way to do that. There are other reasons why you would put an ADLS in. There's mandatory federal agency requirements. I have BOEM in there, but I meant to put Bureau of Land Management. And then there are mandatory state requirements in at least 7 states that I know of right now. North Dakota being the most stringent. They require an ADLS system for new wind farms and also retrofit to existing wind farms back to, I don't know, I think 2009 or so. And then New York, which has a mandatory requirement to look into the possibility, the fiscal and technical feasibility of putting in an ADLS system. And really that's, at this point, it looks to be a subjective discussion between the stakeholders and the New York Utility Commission. And then more importantly, there are many, many, many local, county, and municipal requirements that are popping up as developers try to put up new wind farms or repower existing wind farms. It gives the community an opportunity at that point to step in and say, hey, hold on a second, we've heard about ADLS, and if you're going to do this, we'd like you to consider it. So my final thoughts before we get to questions is that, I've presented to a number of committees and different organizations, and one of the biggest reservations I hear about ADLS is that it's not a mature product. And yes, while some vendors have had some fits and starts, there are others that have mastered this technology, so there's very little risk. I know we both have dozens and dozens of sites out there that have been deployed. There is an adequate and growing ADLS vendor list, so the customer has technology choices. It is a competitive market, so there's no runaway cost there. I would say that's a good reason for putting in ADLS, and then it does, as I said before, become an effective tool for mitigating the objections to wind farm development, as does many of the radar and wind solutions. That's all I have.
All righty, Jeff. Thank you. We'll hold for questions committee until after we hear from Mr. Andrews, who's up next. Gary Andrews is the CEO of Detect, which is another one of these ADLS aircraft detection lighting systems. Gary, we'll give you about the same amount of time, about 15 minutes max, and then we can open up. We have until about 1:25 total, so we want to be able to have the committee have the time to ask a bunch of questions. So if you're online, Gary, I don't know if you want to have us advance the slides or not.
I can advance the slides here, I believe.
All righty. And Jade, if we could put his, there we go. Okay, we can see you. And do we have the slides?
I'm sharing, but I don't see the slides yet.
Let's see here. Any issues up there, Jade? Yeah, we don't see them yet either.
Maybe I'll let Jade just pull them up then.
Okay, just have Jade pull them up. All righty.
Yes, please.
He's doing that, or Jade's taking care of that right now. There we go. Okay, yeah, just like on the last one, just Gary, just let us know when you want to advance slides, and we'll go from there.
Oh, very good. Again, I'm Gary Andrews. I'm the president and CEO of Detect Inc. We're a U.S. manufacturer of various radar technologies with offices worldwide and about 800 systems operating. We've been supplying radar systems to the wind energy sector since about 2003, starting with a bird radar product that we developed for the U.S. Air Force that is used for mitigating bird mortality at wind farms around the world. Again, some of the briefing I have kind of touches on things that Jeff already went into. Basically an aircraft detection lighting system is a sensor-based system that will monitor the airspace around a wind farm. And once it detects aircraft crossing a predefined perimeter, here in the US, it's 3 nautical miles, it will activate the lighting. As Jeff says, most of the systems actually suppress the lighting, allowing the lights to come on when aircraft are detecting crossing the perimeter. The first ADLS installed in the United States was a system we installed in 2009 at a wind farm in Arizona. So we actually put our first ADLS in long before the FAA had looked at the ADLS as a solution. The push actually started back in the 1950s by astronomers and night sky groups, dark sky groups wanting to reduce light pollution, particularly in rural areas. And wind farms specifically became a focus in the 2000s. Next slide, please. Again, the FAA started looking at the technology in 2011. They issued their circular in 2015, which basically approved this technology for use on wind farms. Canada, Australia, Germany have all issued similar standards. Again, as Jeff mentioned, multiple states are now passing regulations requiring ADLS for new wind farms and retroactively on existing wind farms, again, especially in rural areas. And a lot of local county commissions are also setting forth some regulations for wind farms. For a vendor to actually supply an ADLS, it has to be tested and evaluated by the FAA. The FAA does not actually approve or certify these systems. What they do is they test the system and they compare it to the requirements of the advisory circular. And they issue a letter to the vendor called a tech note, which basically says that the system as tested met the requirement. The obligation for meeting the standard still depends depends on a project by project basis, and both the manufacturer of the system and the developer have to certify that the system meets the requirement. Again, as Jeff already identified, there's 3 main ADLS suppliers. Actually, it's almost down to about 2, with just Detect and Terma being the main providers in the industry. As he mentioned, Lawfer, a startup company, didn't last very long. Investus, it's a bit unclear how aggressively they're promoting their ADLS product. Next slide, please. Again, this is just a different illustration from how the ADLS operates that Jeff showed. Basically, the FAA says that the system has to be able to see all aircraft around the wind farm 360 degrees from an altitude of 200 feet above ground level to 1,000 feet above the highest obstacle. And when the aircraft crosses the preset 3 nautical mile perimeter, the system will allow the lights to come on. Similar to the Terma systems, Detect system uses a alert perimeter of about 3.5 nautical miles that again confirms that we have a good track of the aircraft coming in. All the radars will actually see the aircraft much farther out than 3 to 3.5 nautical miles. As Jeff mentioned, usually it's 30 to 40 mile diameter that we're actually detecting and seeing the aircraft coming in. There are various designs on the market. There's ground-based systems where the radar is mounted on a tower. That's the most common systems. The Vestas system actually mounts the radars on the turbine monopoles around the wind farm. Again, the objective of the technology is to keep the lights off as much of the time. We've actually got about 80 or so installations operating in the US, Canada, and Europe right now. And a recent analysis we did of all those operating installations all the way back to 2008 indicates that on average, the systems seem to keep the lights off about 97% of the time. Again, the closer you are to an airport, the more that the lights are going to stay on. The heavier the terrain, the more the lights are going to stay on. The more rural the site, the lights are going to stay off more. How radar works, everybody's probably pretty familiar with it. It basically sends out a signal and then receives that signal and calculates the distance to the target and develops the tracking for that target. Next slide. One thing we have to factor into ADLS installations is the terrain. Radar is a line of sight technology. It can't see behind trees or buildings or behind the mountains. So sighting ADLS for a wind farm project requires a lot of analysis by the developer and the installer to make sure that we can reliably and demonstrate to the FAA that we can see all the aircraft around the wind farm. So one of the first things we do, next slide, is to do a detailed model of the wind farm site and develop viewshed analyses using geographical information systems and other evaluation technologies we have to confirm that we can reliably see aircraft approaching the site 360 degrees around the site in all directions within the limits that the FAA sets. This is done in a very intensive modeling analysis that helps us determine how many ADLS sensors are going to be needed, where they should be placed at the wind farm, and where we may have visibility installations with the aircraft approaching the wind farm. Again, Kansas, I'm fairly familiar with that, being from Texas myself originally. It's a fairly flat area, so terrain issues in Kansas and our projects there are fairly straightforward. Next slide. The main ADLS components is obviously the radar sensor, which is monitoring the airspace, detecting targets. Our ADLS, in addition to using a radar, also incorporates a device called an ADLS-B receiver. That is actually a transponder receiver that allows us to receive information on aircraft that are flying around the wind farm if they're equipped with an ADS-B. Almost all commercial aircraft in the United States now have ADS-B incorporated. And what we can do with that is we can actually get the detailed information on the altitude of the aircraft so that we don't have to activate the lights for high flying commercial aircraft that may be at 20, 30,000 altitude going over the wind farm. And again, the radar is monitoring the airspace. There is a processor system in our configuration that's actually installed in the operation building, other than out at the radar. It processes all the data and communicates with the wind farm. And when aircraft are detected approaching the wind farm and crossing the boundary, it will activate the lights. One of the early things that we had to factor into the ADLS too is early on, a lot of the lights were not compatible with ADLS. They could not be remotely controlled. They were just photovoltaically activated. So on some of the retrofit projects, in addition to installing the ADLS, we may also have to replace the lights or add connectors to the lights that allow us to get them on the wind farm network to activate them. There's a lot more that goes into an ADLS than just the radar and its system. There's radar towers, foundations, fencing, getting power and fiber to that also that can also add into the cost of the projects. Next slide. To give you an idea of kind of the cost of an ADLS as a rule of thumb, the ADLS sensor, the processors and the software typically costs about in the $500,000 to $600,000 US range. The radar tower foundation and installation of that typically adds about another $150,000 to $200,000 to the wind farm or to the ADLS project cost. And then of course the tower has to have connection to power and fiber to be able to communicate to the wind farm network. So fiber and power does have to be run to the ADLS tower installation site. That's usually connected from a turbine that's closest to the radar tower, usually within 800 to 1,000 feet. That's a fairly expensive component though. It adds another, say, $400,000 to $600,000 to the cost of the project. And then there's a process of commissioning and validating that the system is functioning properly, as well as optimizing the system that adds another $75,000 to $100,000. So the total cost to install an ADLS is typically in the $1.2 million to $1.5 million range, again, depending upon the complexity of the project. Again, some projects with a lot of terrain issues or very large projects may need multiple ADLS units installed. So those costs can go up proportionally for those. Other costs that can impact the cost of putting in an ADLS is the ADLS compatible lights. As I mentioned, most of the lights on the market today are ADLS compatible. So the cost is not excessive. For retrofit projects though, the lights may need to be replaced, or we'll have to install a lighting interface to get that light connected to the wind farm. And then there's long-term operations and maintenance costs, which are typically running about $1,500 or $15,000 to $20,000 a year over the life of the project. One thing I do want to stress about the commissioning of an ADLS is that the radar is a system that will work right out of the box, but it has to be tuned and optimized for each specific project site. So once the system is commissioned and started up, there can be a process of anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months of optimizing the system to really reach the lowest possible lights on period with safe flight operations. So sometimes there's a little confusion as the project starts up that it's not keeping the lights off the maximum amount of times, and that's tied to the commissioning process. And that's pretty much the overview that I had. I didn't want to spend too much time reiterating some of the things that Jeff went into, but we'll certainly be available to answer any questions that you might have, and appreciate the time today.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate it very much. Jeff, if you're still online, I'm going to open it up to questions to the committee and for either of you, and see what questions anybody might have. Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I'm from the world headquarters of Garmin, what role does GPS play, or is this, this may be just radar use, but I would think once we pinpoint each one of these towers, I mean, why couldn't they be logged in on some kind of GPS map? Just a question.
Jeff or Gary, whichever one wants to take this one.
Well, I'm sure Terma's system is similar to ours. GPS and geographical information systems are the kind of the foundation of these type technologies that we're talking about today. So all of the towers, the turbines, everything are our GPS located and in the system, in the geographic information system. And we do use the GPS in our system from the radar transponder from the aircraft with the ADS-B. So it is integrated. Now, in Germany, they're allowing ADLS only based on ADS-B. The problem with that type of approach is that there are aircraft out there flying that do not have transponders in them. So the US has a very aggressive civil aviation business. So in the US, we are still using the radar and ADS-B combined systems. But GPS is a component of that.
Senator Fagg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering, have you had any failures of any of the radars that you've set up? And if so, maybe talk about power backup. That's one question. The other one is, can a flock of birds set this off?
I'll take that, Gary, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah, so in terms of the power, we leave the power, the determination of whether there's backup power system to the developer. However, we've always said there's really no need for that, because the default is if the power goes out or there's any glitch in the comms, the lights come on automatically for safety. So there's no safety issue related. In terms of can anything else turn it on, we did have some issues up in North Dakota. We found out that Canadian geese, which travel in a flock, a large flock of birds, and they're a large bird as it is, they present themselves to a radar just like a plane, especially if there's a tailwind. So we look at 60 knots as being the barrier for a legitimate target for enabling or disabling lights. And sometimes a flock of birds can meet that speed, and they have the same size as a small airplane. So we've had issues with that we've worked out. We've improved the kinematics and the artificial intelligence in the radar to eliminate that. The biggest, challenge that we've had is that we have the ability to see inside the wind farm despite the noises generated by the turbine blades. And so what happens is those birds will fly into the area. They look like a plane. We enable the lights, and then when they land to feed at a pond, we have a timeout penalty imposed by the FAA. If you lose the track inside of the wind farm, you must keep the lights on for 30 minutes. And so those lights remain on. 30 minutes goes by, we turn them off, and the next thing you know, the darn birds take off and start flying again. So there's been some adjustments we've had to make up in the north there, North Dakota, South Dakota, to accommodate that. We haven't really seen that problem anywhere else.
Yeah, I would add to that birds are always an interference issue. From DTEC's perspective, we started out developing a bird radar for the U.S. Air Force in 2003. And we've developed some fairly sophisticated AI algorithms that allow us to do some real-time differentiation between bird and non-bird targets. But typically it is to be expected that some of those targets will slip through the algorithms, particularly during the fall and spring migratory seasons. So you will see the lights on a little bit more during those migratory seasons. When birds are migrating, as Jeff mentioned, they're following the winds, and they can be traveling at fairly high speeds and can look like large aircraft moving. They can have a radar cross-section similar to that. So despite the best bird suppression algorithms that we have and the bird identification algorithms, it is a problem for radar, and that radar does see all the targets in the atmosphere.
Any rain fade issues? Some certain type of radar is better at that than others.
Yes, there is. Yeah, the FAA, the X-band radars, which are typically used for these ADLSs, are susceptible to rain interference. So once we get up to moderate rain events, the system will have to revert to lights on. But by then you've got a visibility issue anyway, and the lights should be on. And we do have an...
Oh, go. Sorry.
I was going to add that we do have an S-band based version of this system that we're using in Canada that has not been approved for the US yet. It has better resilience in rain, but we're not allowed to use it in the US yet.
One other question. I want to make sure I'm clear on the FAA approval process. For a developer to apply, in other words, to the FAA, are they just basically applying for the FAA to come out and do the testing once they've determined which type of system to use? Can you just clarify so I'm very clear on how this process works, because I think the bill speaks to that a little bit.
The FAA,
Jack, you want to take that?
you want to be considered as a ADLS provider, you apply to the FAA, and the FAA works out. There's an application process. There's also a testing that they'll set up to evaluate the system. And then, as Gary said earlier, what you will get is a tech note that says you met the testing requirements as they set it up. So they're not there to enforce how effective it is once it gets to the wind farm. They're just saying that you are doing what the FAA wants you to do for that particular technology.
But I think the senator's question was addressed more to, if I'm a developer and I want to put in an ADLS, what approval do I have to get from the FAA? And what the developer has to do is submit an obstruction lighting plan to the FAA. And if they're considering an ADLS, then the vendor will prepare a whole series of analyses of the wind farm supporting the use of the ADLS that goes into that obstruction lighting plan, which they submit to the FAA, and the FAA will approve. The FAA is kind of backlogged on this, so we're seeing it taking anywhere from several months to 6 months to get an ADLS approval back from the FAA as for the developers. It's not, we don't actually submit that to the FAA for the developer. They usually have an airspace consultant that is doing that, because it's more than just the ADLS at that point.
So from a county commission standpoint, all they would be interested in would be that the FAA has approved the system for a particular wind project, correct?
Yeah, the FAA will, typically the developer will submit their obstruction plan to the FAA. That'll include the ADLS and all the backup documentation. The FAA will come back and say, yes, we think ADLS is suitable for this project. And they will give their okay to that obstruction lighting plan.
Any other committee? Senator Francisco, I think she has.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is for, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Mr. Schleicher? Schleiger? So you mentioned during your testimony that the times to install this would be during construction, or you mentioned when you were repowering an existing wind farm. Can you explain that repowering and how that might differ from just asking a wind farm to that's already constructed to install such a system?
And so what I was referring to there is the ways that there are mandatory requirements. So if a new wind farm is built and it's mandatory, then we will work with the developer to design everything necessary, all the infrastructure to put the ADLS in while the wind farm is being built. In some cases, like North Dakota, they are requiring older wind farms to retrofit an ADLS system into an existing wind farm, mainly because, you know, why have the lights out on a new wind farm if it's surrounded by the older wind farms that still have the lights on? In that case, it gets a little bit more challenging for the developer, because they have to go out in many cases, as Gary said, and buy new lights for one thing. And then at that time, they've already designed the fiber network, and so maybe there's some adjustment that has to be made to accommodate the ADLS. And then a third area, which I had mentioned, was that if a wind farm is going to be repowered and you're going to put the bigger sticks up, a lot of times the county commission will say, well, that's kind of a new development. You're taking the old towers down and you're putting the new ones up. We'd like you to consider ADLS at that time. And then again, it's a choice of whether there's any fiber redesign that needs to take place to accommodate that. But ADLS can be put up at any wind farm, whether it's already developed or it's being developed.
Okay, Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How many states do they allow right now to have radars in them?
For ADLS or just radars in general? Right now, there's.
For the ADLS.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's no state that does not allow ADLS to be installed. Most of the activity that we're seeing is, say, in a half a dozen to a dozen states where there is a lot of push for ADLS. specifically like North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Wyoming. We've seen a lot in Arizona, upstate New York, the northeastern states. They seem to be the states that are most active. The radars that both Terma and DTECT use are fairly common radars for terrestrial use, and we really don't have any, interference or other limitations on using these systems throughout the United States. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I have another question. So with the flatter terrain of Kansas, would it be safe to say the average, say, a wind farm with 100 turbines could easily use one radar? Do you have to have multiple radars? Or it sounds like the detection area is large enough that unless this was a massive installation, that one radar site could do what it needs to do for an entire turbine farm. Is that correct?
Well, it varies depending on the vendor. I can speak for ourselves. We have a 32-mile wide diameter of coverage. So as long as the wind farm is within that coverage area, the only factor then is the terrain, because the more rugged the terrain, the taller the tower. And of course, the tower size with the steel prices today affects the overall price of the ADLS in a serious way. But I would say in candidates, easy rolling terrain, single radar on a fairly mediocre tower, maybe 20 meters.
Yeah, I would generally agree with Jeff. Some of it depends upon the configuration of the wind farm. Is it a long linear wind farm, or is it a block of turbines? Our system has a 36 diameter, 36 nautical mile diameter range. So these radars do see the aircraft a lot farther than the FAA activation limit. We just have to sight the tower to demonstrate to the FAA that we can reliably see the aircraft approaching, track them, and allow the lights to turn on before it get at the FAA mandated 3 nautical mile border. So generally, yes, it kind of depends. It is we are dealing with aviation safety here. So, when in doubt, it pays to be cautious. And, we don't want projects where we have trouble getting the ADLS fully functional simply because, we have some weak areas of coverage. One thing we do for every project that DTECT does is we do flight tests after the project is commissioned to, again, verify that all of our original modeling was correct. And knock on wood, we've not missed one yet. So
That's good.
Standard.
Do you put the radar system in the middle? I mean, if you're talking about the size or an elongated area or something, do you tend to try to sight it in the middle rather than on the edge of a industrial scale farm?
Well, with our range, it doesn't really matter where the radar goes. What we try to do is find a location within the project boundary that the customer has identified. And a lot of times I'll say to them up front, if you have a particular location you'd like us to consider, whether it's near an O&M building or a maintenance building, or let's say in a pro-wind friendly farmer's field, we will look at that first, and then we'll see what the coverage looks like and what the tower size would be, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'd agree with Jeff. I mean, we rarely get to put the radar exactly where we would like to put it because there are a lot of variables that go into this: leases, natural cultural resources. So we'll typically come up with a first pass of ideal locations and then have to go through several iterations with the customer on finding the ideal location. And again, we try to site it so that it minimizes other construction related costs, because just getting fiber and power to the radar site can cost more than the radar in some cases.
Sure. Oh, sure. And then time frame to retrofit on some of the older, older turbines. What would you say, from the approval process with the FAA through a reasonable amount of time to retrofit? Would you say 2 years, 3 years, in terms of giving them some grace period if we decide to require that during the repower? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll go first if you don't mind,
Go
Gary.
ahead,
So,
Jeff.
so usually we work with the customer for weeks and weeks and weeks, well before we get a purchase order to finalize that final radar location. Once that radar location is determined, it takes about 6 months from the receipt of the purchase order to delivery of the equipment on site. And then, of course, as Gary said, there's commissioning that has to happen. That could take 1 week to a month or more. And then what we do is that all that information is being processed by the developer while we're going through the process itself. But once that final radar location is determined, they can go ahead and file the paperwork with the FAA. And so the time it takes the radar to be ordered and delivered on site, all that can be, completed.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, if you just look at the basic timeline, once an ADLS, a wind farm developer decides to put in ADLS, it can take 3 to 6 months for him to even get feedback from the FAA on whether or not he can get it approved for an ADLS. And then, delivery time for us is similar, about 6 months or so. So, you can have a full year from start to finish just to get a project deployed. So lead time, a grace period for developers to go retrofit all existing projects, a year would be the absolute minimum, I would say. And that probably even potentially cuts it a little tight.
I would say internally, we always say 12 to 18 months.
Yeah.
And that would be from the point where they decide to repower. Say we use that as a trigger, for example. So, when you decide to repower, just trying to look at a reasonable time frame. So 2 years would probably be reasonable, a little bit longer, a little bit less.
I'm not a developer, but that would sound reasonable to me.
Okay. Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm wondering if either of you could give the committee some reasons that the FAA would not approve the ADLS system.
You want to go on that, Jeff, first?
I'll just tell you from my experience. So the one thing I found out about the FAA early on is they will never disallow an entire ADLS system at a wind farm because there's a little bit of a coverage gap in certain areas. What they will do is they will say that the number of turbines over in that gap area the lights would have to be left on while the rest of the wind farm would be disabled. And so the community, at least in the most of the wind farm, would be super happy. It would only be those folks up there where there was a coverage issue. I've also noticed too, though, that there's been some flexibility in the FAA's approval process lately. One of the line of sight issues that we have, especially in flat terrain like Kansas, is if the land suddenly slopes down, let's say to a riverbed, and then comes up on the other side. Well, there'll be a gap over the river because the radar simply can't see down. And if that drop is below 200 feet, then that causes a gap area in the coverage analysis. But the FAA looks at that and says, well, there's, no pilot would just fly along and dive down into that creek and then fly back up again. So there is some, let's say, common sense application of the approval process, which I've been very pleased with lately.
Yeah, I think we're seeing the same thing from the FAA. They're fairly reasonable if we can present them with a plausible solution to detection or coverage issues. I'd say the other factor that comes into some projects that may or may not make it candidate for an ADLS is proximity to an active airport. If you're in an area where there are a lot of planes taking off and landing or flying at lower altitudes in that area, you can have, potentially very high lights on periods simply because of the aircraft activity. That said, we do have a system up in New Jersey consisting of 5 radars that's in an area with a lot of airports, and it's successfully operating. So there's ways to address a lot of these issues around these sites. But, in some cases you do get sites where, like Jeff mentioned, where you may have a detection zone where you're a little bit weak and the FAA does seem reasonably open to discussion on alternatives to dealing with those areas.
Yeah, and I would also argue that most aircraft traffic in the United States ends around midnight, except for the red eyes that are flying at 35,000 feet. So after 11 p.m., you're really not going to see those lights coming on anyway, even if there is an airport nearby.
Senator Francisco?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is the same true for proximity to a military installation? Are there concerns with that?
Yes. With the military, but I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say with military bases, it's particularly of concern, if you're in an area with the low-level training routes and things like that, which, again, there are a lot of low-level flight routes across the United States for military training, and those have to be factored in to siting in ADLS also. Probably one of the biggest concerns, though, with military bases is not so much whether or not you're going to have an ADLS. It's the turbines potentially creating a radar fence or shield to block some of the military radars.
But that would be factored in the FAA approval process, correct?
Yes, that's happened on a lot of wind farms that have been proposed close to military bases.
Okay. Do the military jet planes have the ADS-B system so that the turbines are activated by that?
They do, but they don't always have them turned on.
Gotcha.
Most of them do, but they don't always have them turned on.
Any other questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you, gentlemen. Very comprehensive. We appreciate your time. This will help us a lot as we contemplate hearing Senate Bill 478, which we'll hear on Wednesday and Thursday. Committee, tomorrow we're going to hear HCR 5023, which is coming to us denouncing the price gouging and market manipulation of the natural gas market. So we'll consider that tomorrow. And thank you for your time and your work. And with that, we are adjourned.